Great. Okay, I'll give it another minute and then I think we'll kick off. Let's see if some more people join. Okay, I think we'll kick off then. Hopefully some more people join throughout. So welcome to our World Water Week talk on environmental markets. The purpose of this talk today is to go through some of the key questions that markets face from the feasibility and design stage to the delivery stage. My name is Tamsin Chisnell. I'm an environmental scientist from Arup, London, and I'll be introducing and chairing the session for you today. We have two fantastic speakers lined up for you. We have Dr. Ben Barnford. Ben is a research fellow at the University of Exeter, where he works with Dragon Capital Key team on biodiversity economics. His expertise is in mechanism design as applied to the environment and has worked on issues ranging from how to effectively monitor environmental pollution through to trading of environmental services. As part of his research agenda, he has worked with numerous stakeholders across sectors to operationalize environmental markets. We also have David Young. David is an environmental scientist by training and was a founding executive director of Natural England. He's worked on the co-design of a range of environmental markets in the UK and Australia, including white certificates and distributed energy supply, as well as markets to reduce water pollution and improve biodiversity. His work is focused on how environmental markets operate at the interface of environmental science, law, and economics, and the conditions necessary for developing high-integrity markets at scale. Great. So both Ben and David have two questions that they'll be taking us through today. Ben will be talking first and talking us through why environmental markets are needed and how do we deliver environmental markets efficiently. And David will be talking us through what the need is for high integrity environmental markets and how do you deliver these high integrity environmental markets. So we have about 35 minutes of presentational material to provide you, and then we've got 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. So if you could add your questions to the chat, we'll pick them up at the end of this session and you should be able to ask the speakers directly your questions. That would be great. Great. So I'll just start by touching on the key challenges the water sector is facing. So the first is the issue of water quantity. So too much versus too little water, resulting in devastating impacts we've been seeing over the past few years with shocking floods and droughts across the world. The other issue is of water quality. So globally and locally, we're experiencing large-scale pollution events into our watercourses, lakes, and oceans. Both challenges cause really shocking, painful social, economic, and environmental impacts globally and locally. And these are impacts anticipated to rise in frequency and magnitude due to climate change. So today we're going to talk to you about environmental markets, which is an approach to help the water sector adapt to these pressing challenges. So before I hand over to Ben, I just wanted to talk to you through who the consortium is and what they do. So the consortium, Environmental Market Consortium, is a group of organizations that work together to design and deliver high integrity environmental markets. It began in 2015 when Entrade was established to develop a trading mechanism to deliver nitrate offsets in a UK harbour catchment by the UK water company Wessex Water. In 2017, a reverse auction platform was created to allow farmers to get paid to complete activities that reduce nutrient pollution, which they could do so more efficiently than Wessex Water could through their network. Then in 2018, the University of Exeter came on board to help Entrade develop and test different auction mechanisms. By 2019, Entrade secured contracts to run 35 auctions, which resulted in £2.8 million worth of deals with farmers. In 2020, Wheatley Young Partners then led the process to develop a new market design and business model for catch-up markets. Also in 2020, a new market trading platform was developed using the University of Exeter Lindsay mechanism, which is based on Nobel Award-winning economics. Arup then came on board in 2021 to use our technology, digital tools, and help develop a market platform and operating system. So since then, in 2021, 3 catch-up market demonstration projects were established in the Bristol Avon, the Somerset and the Solent catchments. In 2022, the consortium has been engaged by a range of different stakeholders to develop new nutrient, sustainable urban drainage and water neutrality markets in England and Wales. This year, we've had successful running and settlement of the first biodiversity market in the Bristol Avon catchment and the first nutrient market in the Somerset catchment. So alongside this, we're currently in the process of scoping out the opportunity to implement high integrity markets elsewhere. So if you're interested in this, please do reach out and we'd be really happy to talk to you about this. Great. So I'll just hand over to Ben now.
Thanks, Tamsin. As Tamsin mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit first about why markets. Why do we think environmental markets can help to solve these issues? Next slide, please. I guess the kind of starting point might be just to kind of highlight that there are a range of environmental issues out there of which I'm sure you're aware. So you can kind of think about climate change, you can think about rapid biodiversity loss, be it kind of biodiversity in general or fish stocks that we're exploiting and indeed overexploiting to the point of collapse. But the key issue that's inherent in all of these cases is that the environmental costs of damage are external to the actors making those decisions. As we pollute, as we drive in our cars, the fact that we're having impact on carbon emissions, for instance, it is external to the costs and benefits that we're weighing up when we make that decision to go and drive. So if we could go to the next slide, that obviously creates a need for some corrective policy in here, a policy response to solve these issues. There are a range of different possible policy responses out there. So you can think about government spending, as in the case of the Indonesian moratorium on deforestation, in which the Norwegian government paid the Indonesian government to maintain its forests standing up. But that, of course, doesn't change the actors' decisions. It doesn't change the incentives that they face as they make that decision on whether or not to clear land. You can also think about technology standards. So each of us, or at least if you have a car, you'll also have a catalytic converter, right? It's mandatory to have these fitted to reduce your pollution emissions. Yet this, taking kind of technology standards further, actually potentially negates really easy wins. Some low-cost options are kind of ruled out if they don't happen to comply with the standard. Better in terms of making actors make different decisions then might be some form of Pigouvian tax. Let's price in the kind of environmental damage that they're doing, kind of in the same way that was done, for instance, with the 5p plastic bag charge that was introduced here in the UK. But then you need to be really quite certain about the cost of that environmental damage, how much harm you're doing to society. Finally, we might have something more like a kind of target and trade system, where rather than requiring certainty in the cost of damage, we need to know the quantity that we want to achieve. You can think then of the nutrient neutrality legislation that we'll come on to talk about that applies across the EU. You can think of the UK's new biodiversity net gain legislation, requiring improvements above the damage that's done. Or you can think, as this map just shows, about the emissions trading programs that exist for carbon emissions. So if we could just move on to the next slide, then out of these policy responses comes the question of why markets. Why do we think target and trade and markets more generally is a good policy response option here? And there's kind of at least 4 things that markets do really, really well. The first, and possibly the most important, is that they're very, very efficient at allocating the cost, at least if you design them right, they are. right? And so by that, I mean that the people with the lowest costs to deliver emission reductions in pollution, for instance, improvements in water quality or reductions in flood risk, we select those people with the lowest cost to deliver those services. Second, it offers the option for innovation. We're going to pay you for delivering those services. We're not paying you for particular ways in which you deliver those, and you can innovate and again drive costs down. It allows systems thinking across different environmental services, as I'll begin to touch on later on. So for instance, in the UK, you can comply or you can deliver biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality improvements in water quality on the same parcel of land. And that's really important for cost minimization more broadly. And finally, it allows voluntary demand to come into this space as well. We know, for instance, in carbon markets, there's a huge range of stakeholders keen on buying carbon services, as in carbon sequestration. And similarly, like that voluntary demand, that's non-regulated demand, can come into these markets for other environmental services as well. Hopefully that's given you a bit of background on why we think markets are a good idea. Of course, not only do we need markets, not only do we need markets to be a good idea, which we argue that they are, but also we need those to be high integrity. And so with this, I'll pass over to David, who's going to talk us through the need for these markets to deliver on that front.
Thanks, Ben. For a range of people, the idea that markets, which have for many have been the cause of the environmental destruction and the challenges that Tamzin so clearly outlined earlier, should be also then the solution to these problems is really quite problematic. In fact, for many people, it'd be far simpler to simply say government should step in, regulate for the outcomes, and use taxpayers' funding to improve the environment. The challenges we're facing, though, at a global scale, both in climate change and the decline of biodiversity, are universally accepted, though, to be beyond the resources of simply governments acting alone. So we have to bring in private capital, and we have to bring private capital in at scale. But of course, as we've seen catastrophically in voluntary carbon markets, there's a real problem with the issues of integrity. Indeed, as some people have claimed, corruption. Now, in fact, there's been an enormous amount of benefit that's been achieved and delivered as a result of some of those voluntary carbon trading schemes, but they are corrupted by many of the schemes which lack the governance and the integrity that we need. I often, when I speak, talk about trust. And financial centres like the centre of London are not trusted financially and globally because they are unregulated, but because they are well regulated. And so what I want to talk about now is some thinking that we've been doing following the release of the Dasgupta review into the economics of biodiversity, to think about what we need to create high integrity markets. Next slide, please. So at a practical level, we have to think about why this matters. Well, in this diagram, what you see is we're trying to make a transition from asset-based solutions to environmental problems, in this case, water pollution, where we are using large amounts of energy, large amounts of chemicals to solve problems of nitrate and phosphate pollution in isolation from the other environmental impacts. At the other end of the spectrum, we're trying to deliver that through nature-based solutions. And one of the challenges with nature-based solutions is they're less certain. They're less clear in terms of the outcomes that are delivered. And many people are very familiar with the catchment-based approach to solutions, but often they remain siloed as well. For example, you can stop erosion from farm tracks by putting vast swathes of concrete down with huge amounts of embodied carbon. And you can stop erosion into watercourses by fencing the tops of streams, but without thinking about the stream as actually an ecological system which would be far better off lined with vegetation. So, as Ben has referred to earlier, we need to move to integrated solutions, and that requires us to think very carefully about integrity. Next slide, please. So we've looked at a range of markets around the world. Environmental markets are not new. We've had air quality markets in the US for 25 years or so. And of course, in areas like energy and renewable energy, we've had schemes in the UK and in Australia and elsewhere that have delivered enormous amount of private investment into environmental solutions, in this case, wind and solar and other forms of renewable energy. In the UK, we have our Woodland Carbon Code, which is a particular solution to sequestering carbon through woodland. And in Italy and in other countries, they've pioneered schemes to look at how you incentivize energy efficiency so that we reduce and lower the use of energy as well. A particular market that's important here in Australia is the Reef Credit Scheme, which is basically a scheme to reduce water pollution running from the catchments of the Great Barrier Reef into the protection of that World Heritage area that's so rich in its biodiversity. And when you look at all of these schemes together, there are a number of key market elements, and they are usually well structured and well articulated in clear market rules and processes that govern these markets. Next slide, please. So between 2020 and 2022 in the UK, a broad consortium of environmental organisations, government agencies and the business sector came together in a collaboration to set out what was required to create high integrity markets. And it basically boiled down to three things: really effective market design, getting the policy right, the incentives right, and the institutional architecture. Really clear market governance around standards, accreditation, monitoring and verification underpinned by robust data, and market operations, standardized ways for people to engage with market rules with confidence, have contracting and financial arrangements, and market infrastructures such as trading platforms and repositories to actually make the markets work in practice. And so, next slide, please. Since we've come up with that framework, this is the model that we've been using to think about how to actually design and deliver these markets in practice. The key point from this diagram is that market design is a multidisciplinary task. It involves bringing together the environmental science with the legal principles and the economic mechanisms, market mechanisms, to create an optimal design. And when you see markets fail, it's often as a result of one or other of those disciplines getting out of balance and out of whack with each other. Overly complex environmental markets that don't work in the real world because they're not efficient, because they're bogged down in hugely complex regulation, or laissez-faire markets which have a complete lack of governance and a sense of oversight to secure their outcomes that we see in voluntary carbon. So what I'm going to now do is hand back to Ben, sorry, to talk to the bottom of those diagrams, and that is the economics of making markets efficient.
Thanks, David. So as David says, I'm going to be talking now about how we can, in practice, make markets efficient. What does it mean to be efficient? Well, it means selecting those people who have the lowest costs to deliver particular objectives and making sure that the people that benefit from the environmental services we provide are those with the highest value for those services. Now, why do we need efficient markets? Because otherwise, the general public are going to probably rail back against the kind of legislation that's required in order to improve environmental outcomes. So, for instance, if we're focusing on that nutrient neutrality legislation, what we see in the UK is that somewhere between 100 and 150,000 homes are currently held up by it. And that's resulting in the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, thinking about scrapping the legislation entirely. In the Netherlands, they've got the same legislation. There, the government had a plan to buy approximately 1.5 billion euros worth of farms, put nature-based solutions in those. But the net result of that was those farmers turning around and saying, absolutely not, and in effect kicking out the government at the next election. Similarly, when we're thinking about biodiversity net gain legislation in the UK, which will be binding from November onwards of this year, that's already being met with resistance from house builders who worry that the costs imposed on them are simply going to be too high. So that's then the need for efficient markets is so that we can maintain this legislation and demonstrate that it is possible to meet it at reasonable cost. If we move on to the next slide, then it's perhaps worth thinking through how we get to efficient outcomes. So with that in mind, I want to talk about 4 different markets that we've got some experience here working in and designing. So the first was the Woodland Carbon Guarantee auction run by the UK government. It's nationwide. It's for 50 million. There's 50 million pounds in funding available. And the key aim that they had was to deliver as much woodland planting as they possibly could, but while not crowding out voluntary demand for woodland carbon produced sequestered in the UK, and while also making sure that other outcomes that we as a society care about were also being prioritized. For instance, making sure that we were delivering native woodland and a mix of species. With that in mind, we worked with them. We worked with the Forestry Commission to put in a range of different things targeting these specific desired outcomes. So we used a reverse auction with what's called pay-as-bid pricing to deliver on the idea of minimizing costs. We used actually put options, a solution from the wider kind of wider markets in finance. So rather than having to sell their carbon to the government, what was being auctioned or what was being traded was the right to be able to sell, but not the obligation. There's a few other things in there as well, but a key one with a put option, of course, is that you might see speculatively low bids. People just, it's worth something to them to win the option to later sell carbon regardless. And so we had some, we required that if you are successful, you do plant. So you are obliged to plant, but you're not obliged to then sell the sequestered carbon to the government. This has actually been rather successful and is now into its, I think, 7th, but it might be 8th iteration. If we move on to the next slide, these are 2 other problems, now not funded by the UK government, but rather issues that the water companies were having to tackle. So this first one, I think Tamsin touched upon Entrade's role in the Poole Harbour auctions there, where they needed to reduce nitrogen loading in the downstream catchment. Again, a priority was really to make sure that they can do this at low cost. And so a reverse auction was appropriate there. However, there were real concerns about the fact that it was being repeated. This is a scheme for cover crops, planting, which happens every year. So the auction happens actually twice a year there. And there was a concern that repetition would lead to bids becoming higher over time if we use pay as bid. There was also massive fairness concerns as well, such as basically the idea that different farmers should not be getting paid different amounts to deliver the same service. And so there were fairness concerns there. And so we used a different pricing rule within the auction. There's also the Slug It Out campaign. Sorry, I seem to put the titles the wrong way around on these, apologies. But there's also the Slug It Out campaign, which was a problem that Anglian Water were dealing with about kind of 5-6 years ago, in which farmers used metaldehyde as a pesticide to kill slugs, but this was then running into the watercourse and incredibly harmful. And so what happened then was the water company, they contacted us and they needed a solution. The problem is that you have to eliminate metaldehyde completely within the catchment for it to be worth anything to the water company. Otherwise, it's entirely pointless. And so we needed to make sure everyone was on board. And because we needed everyone on board, a reverse auction is clearly not appropriate here. And instead, what we did was we paid everyone a participation payment. They got a flat rate just for participating, just for the cost of their time in advance. We then gave them the substitute. So instead of using metaldehyde, they used ferric phosphate, and we covered the cost of that. We gave them a discretionary top-up that was available as well. So there was fear, because of the uncertainty, that ferric phosphate just wouldn't work and the slugs would go and ravage the crops anyway. Instead, so we offered this discretionary top-up payment in which, if that happened, if crops failed as a result, we would pay out to kind of compensate, so insurance. And finally, there was the key problem, of course, is that we can't see what every farmer does every minute, but what we can do is incentivize them to make the right decisions every time. And so we had a performance bonus. If metaldehyde rather remains below this, we'll make sure we'll pay you a bonus for achieving that to each and every individual within the catchment. So if we move on to the next slide, where are we going? Where's the kind of latest developments in this? Well, they're in the space of double-sided markets. So up until now, we've been dealing with multiple sellers, but just one buyer. Now we're in the world of multiple sellers, these farmers who can plant habitat to deliver environmental services, but alongside multiple sellers. In the UK, this is because the government has the nutrient neutrality legislation and biodiversity net gain legislation that I mentioned, which is binding on housing developers. So they need to offset the impacts that they have on the wider environment in order to be able to go ahead with planning permission. We now need not to select just the relatively low cost suppliers, but also those high value buyers. We need to determine the prices at which they do trade. And all the while, it's made really rather complex by the fact that housing developers need a block of credits, and it's all or nothing for them. If they don't get that block, it's pointless. And similarly for sellers, they're going to be selling a block of environmental credits, and they need to go ahead with the whole project or none of it. So what we did was we came up with a mechanism that accounts for these all or nothing bids and offers, and selects the combination which maximizes the surplus. That's the gap between offers, the amount buyers said they were willing to pay, and bids, the amount sellers said they needed to be paid. And now the really neat twist on this is not only do we do that, but we also reallocate the surplus, the difference, as I said, between cost and value, back to those participants fairly, in a way, as Tamsin mentioned, that is based off Nobel Prize winning economics. The future then is not just doing these for one service at a time, as we have done for biodiversity in the Bristol and Avon catchment, and as we have done for water quality in Somerset, but rather being able to do this simultaneously, selling both biodiversity and nutrient neutrality credits together and realizing the efficiency gains from that. And indeed, that's where we're going in the Solent. I think with that, it's time for me to hand back over to David. As you've hopefully have picked up, to deliver on efficiency, it cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. And similarly, to deliver on high integrity markets, as David's just about to talk about, we need governance that matches the problems we're facing.
Thanks very much, Ben. I mean, one of the key lessons that we've learned from all of these markets is that there is a solution to each of the problems, but they have to be located in the real world, in the sense that these are markets which are typically constructed by governments or authorities to secure a particular outcome. And to achieve that, we have to look at things including the market structure. So this is a typology that we've come up with to enable people to think a bit more about the kind of structure that we want in these markets. And there are several parameters that you have to look at: deciding how many buyers and how many suppliers, how many services are going to be traded, and where ultimately is the source of finance going to come from, public or private. And as you can see on the left, you can go from those simple auctions that Ben has been describing, where you've got one buyer, multiple suppliers, the kind of reverse auction model, to the far end, where you've got multiple buyers, multiple suppliers, and multiple services, which is the future that Ben has described. But it is important to help a range of organizations and institutions think through the structure that they need to deliver their outcomes in practice. Next slide, please. Of course, we've shown you the headlines from voluntary carbon. A number of us are sitting rather nervously awaiting similar headlines around nature markets, but we're hopeful that the work that's going on to put in place the market governance to support and oversee these markets will avoid those kind of problems. But it is important to really think through market governance properly. And it really is about building and maintaining the trust and confidence in those markets by looking at these three key elements: the underpinning science and data. Now, that's not to say that it has to be perfect and certain. Indeed, it's a condition of precautionary approach that merely the absence of scientific certainty doesn't mean you shouldn't actually be taking action based on the science that is in fact available. In fact, to fail to act is not precautionary. But you also have to ensure that there are tools and models in place that enable you to confidently estimate the baselines and quantify the improvements above those baselines. Otherwise, it's going to be exceptionally difficult to demonstrate what we call the additionality. And the lack of additionality is one of the key criticisms of some of these less well-designed markets. With those clear baselines and substantial ways of measuring the improvements, you can then certify the outcomes, and you need to then do so through processes of accreditation of projects, people, and the overall outcomes. And last, of course, but not least, the clear and robust scientific monitoring and verification that actually then takes all the learnings from these markets and plays them back in to future thinking. Next slide, please. And then, of course, I've mentioned previously, there is a need to embed this within the legal frameworks and the regulatory frameworks that we have, whether it be the planning approvals that we have in England for housing, or water framework directive requirements across Europe. There is a need to actually contract with landowners to deliver improvements in nature. And there is a need to transfer the rights to the services from nature to buyers. And they need legal agreements that are enforceable and that are actually creating the value in the market. And then there is a need for agreements with regulators, planning authorities, to ensure that those markets are actually operating in a way, and with operators such as Entrade, who can be reliably trusted, but more importantly, overseen. Next slide, please. So we are particularly excited to see now the first results of some of these markets come into practice. This is the first test of the market mechanism that Ben's referred to, the Lindsay mechanism, which has this unique characteristic of sharing the surplus from the trade back to the buyers and suppliers in the proportion to the contribution they make to that surplus. The key point about that is that what it does is it maximizes the value for buyers and suppliers, and it removes the profiteering and the extraction of the value by intermediaries. And this is a diagram which shows in the Somerset catchment market how the traded nutrient credits resulted in over £730 worth of payments to landowners to deliver the nature-based solutions on the ground. Next slide, please. And of course, in the case of the biodiversity market that's been run, we've been able to also demonstrate the scale at which these bonuses and discounts that can apply to landowners and to buyers can work in practice. And what this means is that people are incentivized to bid fairly and openly. Landowners are encouraged to bid at their cost, because if they win, they'll obtain a bonus, and buyers are incentivized to bid at their willingness to pay, because if they win, they will then obtain a discount. In other words, we're trying to eliminate gaming from these markets, people trying to simply play the market in order to make profit. What we want to do is reward landowners who are willing to restore nature on their land, and buyers who are prepared to pay a fair price for the environmental services that are delivered. And the market operator that makes that all come together and work together is properly overseen and oversighted to ensure that these are in fact high integrity markets. Thanks, Tamsin.
Great, thanks both for your excellent insights. So it doesn't look like, I'll just stop sharing my screen, and hopefully you should all be able to turn your cameras on if you would like to, and put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, or pop something in the chat if you don't fancy talking, that's absolutely fine. But yeah, we've now got a good 25 minutes for Q&A with David and Ben. So welcome any questions. If not, so I have one for you, David, just to get an economic and environmental process seems quite difficult. Do you have any examples of where this has been achieved in the past and how it was achieved?
One of the best examples is from the renewable energy industry. I mean, I often say to people, just imagine if the government came out one day with a scheme that said, well, if you put some monitoring equipment on your roof for the next 3 years and supply us with the data to capture the incident radiation, we will then perhaps let you put a solar panel on the roof, and then you can measure the renewable energy that comes out of it. And if after 5 years you've achieved this level of output, we might pay you some money. I don't think we'd be having too many solar panels on people's roofs around the world. Instead, people have thought a little bit more sensibly about those kind of markets and done what's called deeming. In other words, they take the science of solar technologies and they estimate the quantity of renewable energy that those solar panels will deliver. And they will then put some precautionary buffers around that, and then allocate those credits for the renewable energy that those panels will deliver to those buyers to those householders or to those suppliers up front. And then they can trade those and use those to then finance the solar panels. It's a fairly straightforward and simple mechanism. But unfortunately, in nature markets, it's very much the case that you have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that, in fact, the biodiversity that we all know delivers this vast range of environmental services is, in fact, delivering exactly the precise amount of, nutrient reduction or biodiversity gain or slowing the flow of floodwaters. And so, of course, that's one of the challenges in nature markets is the uncertainty, and we really do need to bring together the legal principles of providing investment certainty, contracting with suppliers in a confident way, whilst balancing that uncertainty. So it's been done in other markets. We now need to apply it to nature markets.
Great. Fantastic answer. Thank you, David. So we've got a few questions in the chat. The first one is from Vicky Williams. I don't suppose you want to feel free to come on and ask the question, or I can ask it.
says, do you need regulation to develop markets, or can markets operate without regulation? And how do you guarantee high integrity in these markets? Well, it's very interesting. In the UK, I think it'd be fair to say the government has been particularly slow to come forward with a framework for regulating these markets. There's a sort of mindset that says, well, until there's a problem, we don't really see the need to step in and regulate. And I think that that's not really going to work in these markets. There will be a need for regulation. Whether or not it's government regulation is a different question. And so in the absence of regulation in the UK, an entity called the Environmental Markets Board has been established, which is available then to oversight these markets and independently verify that these markets are actually delivering the environmental services that they claim to be doing. So there are ways in which the private sector can essentially organize itself to self-regulate. But I think ultimately there is a need for a framework of regulation from government. But you can go to the opposite extreme. And in Australia, for example, you've got legislation which is now stuck in Parliament around what's called a nature repair market. One of the reasons being is there's a lack of clarity around a whole range of aspects of that market mechanism and how it's going to work in practice. So government stepping in and saying, oh, it's all right, we'll do it all, is often not the answer either. So there's a need to actually think through what is proportionate regulation that can work in practice, that actually can enable us to get on with it and learn from these kind of examples that Ben's talked about to make these markets safe and secure for people. While I'm on a roll, there is another one which I suspect is probably aimed at me, given it's about the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia. Have lessons been learned from Murray-Darling Basin in creating markets for the environment? One of the challenges is that, for example, treated wastewater can help provide farmers in drought-prone India with a lifeline water for livelihoods. They can't pay for the resources where industries can pay for treated wastewater. Can markets balance these uses? I think one of the things that's very clear from large-scale water trading markets is that they're very, very attached to the hydrology and the catchment dynamics that are going on. So, for example, in the US, in California, there's work going on to design water trading markets there. But there are enormous challenges in that market design with what they call return flows. In other words, you allocate water to a landscape, to an agriculture, and then the water flows downstream to another user. In Australia, there is far less of that. The water is simply an allocation. It has to be moved from location A to location B, and then it's used in situ. And there aren't these return flows that apply. And so the markets really, it goes back to Ben's point, you need to design the market to meet the particular challenge of that environmental problem, that environmental situation. So whilst on the surface of it, water quantity is the same in California and Australia, you really do need a different market solution to solve those environmental problems, because the science and the hydrology is different.
Excellent point on location-specific interventions. Thanks, David. So we've got a few questions for Ben in the chat. So one of them is, what do you think the role of markets is in delivering co-benefits?
So I think normally when I think about co-benefits, and I hope this is how you're thinking about it, do correct me if I've misunderstood, but normally when I'm thinking about co-benefits, they are services, environmental services delivered alongside those which are not going to be traded. So for instance, when we're thinking about woodland creation, which is funded and solely funded by carbon, then there would be co-benefits in the sense of potentially providing a site for recreation or something like that for individuals to go and enjoy. I think the role of those or role of markets in delivering of co-benefits, obviously markets, because they incentivize the creation of new habitat, they are going to be delivering against those co-benefit objectives as well. But I think the kind of key for me is to think that those are kind of additional gains, and they shouldn't be being part of what determines the design of the market. Because as soon as co-benefits start to factor in to the design of the market and we start targeting those co-benefits, then they become much less efficient to deliver the other services, right? So if you've got money for carbon, but what you're trying to get at the same time is a bit of recreation, and you try and target recreation specifically, well, then that's going to mean that you go to people that are higher cost providers of carbon, and that can totally erode the market. So I think that would be the caution I would have against them, against co-benefits and the inclusion in the designer markets. Co-benefit markets deliver well against co-benefits, and that's great, and we can record that. But we shouldn't be thinking that markets should be designed for the delivery of services that they're not going to be trading.
Do you think you could explain a bit further, Ben, on co-benefit markets deliver well for co-benefits, but we shouldn't, the last sort of sentence there, shouldn't design them for co?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I mean, we shouldn't, when we're designing markets, we should be designing markets to deliver the services that are being traded.
Yeah.
Because as soon as we start to design markets to deliver against any other objective that isn't the delivery of a particular service, then they become, then the allocations that we arrive at are not those which deliver the services that are being traded at least cost. And because of that, it's going to mean that we're more, the other markets might emerge, by this I mean other markets that are in competition might emerge, which might deliver less well against these objectives. So as soon as you kind of put higher costs on the participants, which in effect is what you're doing if you require a certain level of co-benefits, that's going to make those markets less attractive, function less well, and possibly totally erode the market.
Great, that makes sense. Thank you. Oh, we've got another question for you. There are quite a few coming in now. In the examples you gave, Ben, did the farmers find it easy to engage with the market? Any lessons or insights you could share on how to make it as easy as possible?
Did the farmers find it easy to engage? It depends on the specific the specific problem that we're dealing with. So in general, I think that so the Slug It Out campaign was remarkably straightforward for farmers. I think I would say, like, you'll get paid money to switch if you switch, and you do indeed do kind of as you're being paid to do, then you'll receive a bonus as well. So in that sense, that one was relatively straightforward. I think the auctions less straightforward, that's for sure. It is somewhat harder to engage in an auction than it is a kind of fixed price scheme. That's definitely the case, but that's not to say that they couldn't engage with it. Indeed, they are used to dealing with like auctions in a whole range of other settings, right, within their farm businesses. They go to auctions to buy farm equipment, to buy livestock, all of that kind of thing, really fairly frequently, albeit maybe more used to a pairs bid rule than a uniform price rule, but the uniform price rule has many advantages for the individual bidders. I think the most complicated market, as I guess it might be apparent, was the latest one, the double-sided market, which uses, as David described, the Lindsay pricing, so we can allocate that surplus back to the successful participants. That is more complex, but it has some really easy kind of incentive properties as well, right? So if you're a farmer, bid at your cost. You're never going to go bad. It's never going to go badly if you simply bid at cost, and we can tell people that. So I think helping people, helping them understand the incentives at play is a challenge for sure, but I don't think it's insurmountable. And I don't think that the challenge of explaining how the incentives work or what the incentives are should get in the way necessarily of thinking about getting the right market design in there in the first instance.
Can I just come in on that one? I think in practice, one of the big challenges has been for landowners to estimate the costs of their projects, particularly in the case of projects which have to beyond their land for at least 80 years in the case of nutrient neutrality. It's very difficult for a landowner and a family, for example, to think about the intergenerational costs or value of having these projects on their land for such a long length of time. And so one of the things that's been really important in these two-sided markets has been to quite quickly provide a very good level of transparency around the outcomes in those markets, so that people can see the kind of prices that have been bid, the prices that have been successful, and sorry, I shouldn't use the word prices, sorry, the amounts that have been bid, the amounts that have been successful, and therefore then they can educate themselves in the sense about what the market is willing to pay, and therefore whether it's beneficial to them to think about restoring nature on their land. And so this is a good example where you have to take the economic theory and you have to translate it into usable, tangible information that can actually be applied in practice. And one of the roles that end traders played, for example, is as the market operator to make it as simple as possible for landowners. So the landowners don't have to get their head round carbon pricing and nutrient pricing. What they have to understand is what's going to be paid for a hectare of woodland, or a wetland of a particular size in a particular area. And then they can get on and actually price that and offer to supply that wetland or that woodland, knowing that the finance is going to come from the sale of those environmental services, but without the landowner having to become an expert in the commodities of carbon and nutrients, for example.
It's an interesting one. It sounds like there's potentially a role for communities in there to help, well, with green recovery and jobs side of things, monitoring and verification, but also to help communicate learn those skills and communicate with farmers in their local communities potentially.
Yeah, Vishwanath, part of his earlier question was around the actual sort of economic circumstances and the livelihoods of farmers. One of the key things that again, some of these market mechanisms has enabled us to do is to integrate nature recovery with agricultural production, instead of a market which is simply substituting agricultural production for nature. It is a mechanism that has focused on finding the opportunities to bring nature back into the agricultural landscape and reward the value that creates, while still allowing the land to be used for agricultural production. And that overcomes one of the real key concerns that we've found in the UK, particularly in Scotland and Wales, of large private investors coming in, buying up land or taking up the rights to land for, let's say, carbon, and effectively excluding tenant farmers and other people from the land and their livelihoods. And so it is really important that we understand that these markets sit in a socio-economic context, and we have to think that through in that original market design. This is not just about the law and the economics.
Great, thanks, David. We've got one more question for Ben in here. Appreciate we're almost coming up to time. Is there a difference between resource as a common pool resource, a private resource, or a state resource in the creation of markets?
So short answer, yes, there definitely is a difference in those things. So when we're thinking about common pool resources, those happen when anyone has the right to extract them. So for instance, if you're thinking about fisheries, that's a really easy thing to think about. In most fisheries, anyone has the right to go in and extract that fish. It definitely does depend on the individual fishery, but in general, and likewise, you can't stop other people. So it's very hard to exclude other people. So then that's certainly the case with common pool resources. The key point about the legislation that's actually led to the development of at least some of these markets is that it transforms the property rights from those similar to a common pool resource, right? So you can pollute freely, no one can stop you from doing it. Or for instance, it transforms that into you no longer have the right to do harm to biodiversity, for instance, in the biodiversity net gain legislation. Within nutrient neutrality, you no longer have the harm, the right to cause harm to the downstream watercourse, and instead you have to ensure that the watercourse is as it was left before. So that's all about the property rights that are at play, created by the legislation, and then once you've got that in place, that's when markets in general kind of flourish. Of course, as we've described as well, there are instances in which markets come about through voluntary demand, but again, the key is about property rights. It's about the fact that I can say that I own specifically the particular unit of carbon, the particular ton of carbon, for instance, that's being sequestered. So yes, there are a difference between these sorts of resources in terms of the property rights, and that property right structure then affects how markets are designed.
Great, thanks, Ben. So we've got 5 minutes left. I thought I'd finish with a question for both of you, just asking, what is your hope for environmental markets? Where would you like it to go? So yeah, over to either of you if you've got an answer.
I'll go first then. Look, I think the opportunity for these multi-service markets is enormous. We have to value the full range of benefits that nature provides. You know, the global economy depends on it, and arguably the planet in terms of climate change. So we have to find ways to actually value those environmental services properly. We shouldn't give them away as co-benefits, because that means you will underinvest in the natural environment and natural resources. And so I would hope that these kind of mechanisms start to provide a greater clarity around the value of nature, and putting a fair price on both the services that nature provides, but also rewarding landowners who take that step to restore nature and integrate that nature with existing land use, and in particular agricultural production on a global scale.
Very aspirational and exciting. I love it, David. Ben, do you have any thoughts?
So I think I totally agree with exactly what David said. And I think the kind of question then is, how might we get there? How might we get to a future where the environment is priced in? And in that sense, I guess it's a plea, but also some kind of hopeful views about the need for regulation, right? So markets are really, really, really good, and they can function with voluntary demand for sure. But on top of that, what we're going to need is regulation, so that all of the damages that people are doing are required. They're required to rectify those. And so, for instance, the reason I think that that's hopeful is that what we've seen is the emergence in the last decade of markets for carbon, not just the voluntary ones, also regulated markets. And likewise, we've seen in the UK and the EU, the nutrient neutrality legislation that's come along, and more recently, particularly in the UK, the biodiversity net gain legislation. And that's creating this demand that then markets are really well placed to go, well-designed ones at least, are really well placed to go and offer efficient solutions to. So I think, I guess in that sense, that's how I think we can get to kind of that vision of wider adoption of these markets, which I really do think can begin to solve these problems in ways that are efficient and ways that make sense across, as David describes, a range of different services simultaneously.
Great. Thank you both so much for talking today and providing really interesting and inspiring talks. As I popped in the chat, we've put our emails in the chat. So if you would like to reach out to any of us directly and talk about anything that's mentioned, feel free to do so. And we hope you've enjoyed the talk and the conversations, and hopefully you'll hear a lot more from the work that Ben and David are doing very soon. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and David and Ben for great talks. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining.